This is about the sixth or seventh presentation I've made on the naval aspects of the Civil War, the contributions of the Union and Confederate Navy to the Civil War. Everybody knows something, at least a little bit, about how Lee and Grant were slugging it out on the land, but not many people know about the contributions of the Union and Confederate navies. And I'm here to fill that gap. And the topic tonight is the last stronghold. It's called the last stronghold because it was the last of the Confederate ports that was finally closed to the blockade runners. The blockade runners were the Confederate ships that were able to escape out of the harbors along the Confederate shoreline with cotton and lumber that they could take to foreign ports in exchange for all the war materials that they needed to supply their armies, the shoes and the blankets and the gunpowder and the chemicals and all those things that food that they needed for those armies to continue. And this last stronghold was the remaining exit for the Confederate forces at the very end of the war. We're talking about December of 1864 and January of 1865. Within 3 months of the end of the war, the Union had obviously, because of its material strength, had crushed the South by that time. The end result was evident, and this was just one of the examples of how strong the Union had become as a result of 4 years of buildup of their industrial strength and their army strength. First, we're going to take a look at the location, layout, and defenses. As far as the location is concerned, we're talking about North Carolina. Right here, the intersection of the North Atlantic Squadron, which was tasked to blocking all of the harbors along the shore of Virginia and North Carolina, and the intersection with the South Atlantic Squadron, which had the responsibility of blocking all of the ports all the way down to the end of Florida. This North Atlantic Squadron was commanded by Rear Admiral Samuel Phillips Lee, and he had about 33 ships off the Cape Fear River, which is right here, Cape Fear River, which leads up to Wilmington. He had been there as the commanding officer for several years, and as a result, the blockade runners were losing their shirts. It had been a very lucrative business in an early part of the war because the Union Navy was stretched very thin and didn't have an awful lot of ships and manpower to blockade all the harbors that they needed to stop. And the blockade runners were very successful in getting in and out. And where they went when they sailed was either to Bermuda or to Nassau down here, and sometimes to Cuba. These blockade runners were very small and speedy vessels, but not ocean going. That's why they didn't go any farther than Bermuda or Nassau. There they would unload their cargoes and take aboard the imports that they needed to take back to the Confederate States to run the blockade in the opposite direction and get back into port. The raiders at the beginning of the war almost ran on a schedule. 400 or more in a month could make the trip to Wilmington and some of the other cities. But by the end of 1864, Samuel Lee and his North Atlantic Squadron had closed off almost all, except for Wilmington, as being the last stronghold still open to the imports and exports. The value of the goods that the blockade runners were able to bring in and out was up to $70 million annually. And General Lee up in Virginia was acutely aware that Wilmington was essential to the continuing supply necessary for his armies around Richmond, because Richmond was the final area in which Grant and Lee were opposed. And if Lee couldn't continue to get the supplies out of Wilmington shipped up by railroad, Lee would have to abandon Richmond, take all of the government functions with him, and try to flee westward, where he was eventually, of course, captured. Okay, this gives an idea of where Fort Fisher is. Fort Fisher is what we're calling the last stronghold. Fort Fisher is at the end of what was Federal Point before the war. It became Confederate Point during the war, and Fort Fisher was right down on the end of here, blocking the entrance to the Cape Fear River. Wilmington itself was 28 miles up north and was protected from any sort of naval bombardment because it was so far inland. And the ships, no Navy ships could enter the Cape Fear River because it was too shallow for the heavy draft Union ships. Fort Fisher was guarding the entrances. There was one entrance right here called the New Inlet, and the other entrance on the other side of this small island called the Old Inlet. And that's where the blockade runners escaped on their way out to Bermuda, and back from Bermuda up the Cape Fear River to Wilmington. Admiral Lee, who was commanding the North Atlantic Squadron, continually reminded Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, of the importance of closing that port, but Gideon Welles was distracted. Here's a picture of Wilmington, protected by the 28 miles of river between it and the Atlantic Ocean. It was a prosperous city of about 5,000 and an equal number of slaves. But by the end of 1864, it was a wide open city because the risks taken by the blockade runners attracted an unsavory type of individual who was willing to take risks for the enormous rewards. For example, a ton of coffee that could be imported, could be bought in Bermuda for $200, could be sold in Wilmington for $5,000. And those kinds of profits attracted risk takers and some very disreputable people. But by the end of 1864, those kinds of rewards were limited because capture was much more likely. It used to be that blockade runners had at least a 90% chance of getting through the blockade. But by this time, near the end of the war, it was down to 10% or less of the blockade runners that could get through. In addition to the geographical difficulties facing the Union forces about not being able to get up the Cape Fear River to Wilmington, there were various defenses on either side of the river, smaller, but able to fire across the open water to any ships that it might want to try to enter the Cape Fear River and get up to Wilmington. Here's a close-up of the end of that peninsula where Fort Fisher is located. And Fort Fisher is down near the bottom where you see the words Fort Fisher. All the rest is just sand in the peninsula all the way up to Wilmington. And here's an even more detailed close-up of the fort itself. It consisted of two parts. There was a land face facing north on the peninsula, and there was a sea face facing the Atlantic Ocean. And there were cannons on both of those faces. And where they intersected was called the Northeast Bastion. That was the headquarters of the fort, also where they had their main magazine for ammunition, their hospital, and also barracks for the soldiers. The defenses consisted mainly of traverses, which were mainly mountains 30 feet high of sand. And in between these traverses, as you can see in the land face on the north, there were about a dozen traverses. In between these mounds were parapets where the cannons were located, protected on either side by the traverses of sand so that they could fire straight out, either up into the land of anyone advancing from the north or out to sea against the ships that might be advancing along that face of the fort. The bound battery all the way down at the bottom of the picture was the last protection for any ships that might want to enter the river mouth. This shows a little bit of the details of the cannons. There were more than 44 cannons that the Confederates had lined up on the land face and the sea face of various sizes. And the entry to the fort was over on the left-hand side, called the River Road Sally Port, which was just a gate. That was the only entrance to the fort if you were advancing on land. If you were advancing at the sea face, you'd have to get over those traverses, much more difficult. There wasn't any gate along the sea face. All of the fort was supplied by the Sally Port over on the left-hand side of the land face. As well as a defense in front of the land face, all of the vegetation had been removed, so it was just a sandy beach that provided no cover for anyone advancing on the land face. And of course, the sea face was a beach also providing no cover. Here's a picture of the traverses. These were mounds built 30 feet high of sand by slaves and soldiers over the previous several years, so that these traverses were linked, and in between the traverses were the gun parapets where the cannon were located. And in front, this is a view from, if you were an attacker, this was your view of you advancing on those traverses. And in the sand in front of those traverses, the Confederates had even buried mines that could be detonated by wires that they led back in behind the traverses for detonation. Here's a picture from behind, from inside the fort, seeing the cannon pointing out to sea. And what you're looking at there is a bomb-proof where they stored the ammunition for the cannon and also had some living quarters for the soldiers that manned the cannon. Here's another picture taken from the interior, from behind the traverses, and how they were connected with the parapets and the cannons in between the traverses. The traverses, because they were made of sand, were effective in protecting the cannon because the sand absorbed cannonballs and explosive shells without an awful lot of damage. If they had been built of brick or masonry or something like that, the cannons would knock them down. But the sand had a tendency of just absorbing these shells without any damage. Here's a picture of Battery Buchanan, which was the very last on the southern end of the fort that was also served as a beacon for the battery, for the blockade runners when they were trying to arrive in the middle of the night silently and without being detected. They would use the Battery Buchanan as a beacon to guide them into the river mouth. This is the northeast bastion, the intersection of the land face and the sea face. It also served as the field hospital and the headquarters for the Confederates. So you're looking at it from behind, from the interior view. Here's something that was extremely effective and very deadly for the attackers. It was a palisade, nothing more than sharpened stakes about 9 feet high, a fence, in effect, along the sea face and the land face. And What it was designed to do, obviously, was to slow down any attacker who still had to climb the traverse behind the palisade if they were going to get into the fort. Very difficult and very dangerous. This is a view from the outside again, a view of that an attacker would see trying to get at the intersection of the land face and the sea face. Here's an interior view. On the far left is the gate, which provided the only entrance to the fort and which was key to the battle, because once the gate was breached, there was no way to prevent the soldiers from getting behind the traverses and attacking from both the front and the rear. Here's another view of a bomb-proof from inside the fort, showing how they stored their supplies and their living quarters, as such as they were, behind these huge mounds of sand. And here's an example of firing from a parapet in between a traverse at the ships offshore that would during the battle. These are the kinds of cannon that they had. This is a typical smooth bore, which meant that they had to be loaded from the front, pushing down the powder, pushing down the cannonball, pushing down the wadding to keep everything in place. And then there was a little hole on the top of the cannon at the back that they put a match down to ignite the powder and send the ball on its way. These breech loaders were by this time pretty much obsolete as they were being, these front loaders were pretty much obsolete as they were being replaced by breech loaders. Breech loaders open at the back. Modern cannon open at the back so as you can slide the explosive shell and the powder in and then close it again. Much faster, much more efficient. But this is all the South had, and that's all they could afford to provide to the fort for their defense. Here's their biggest cannon. They had one or two significant cannons. This is one that could throw a 150-pound ball about 5 miles. So this was very effective. The only problem with all of these cannons was a lack of ammunition. The defenders had only about 4,000 shells for all 44 of their cannon. And this one, for example, only had about a dozen shells. They had to conserve them. Otherwise, they weren't going to be able to fire effectively. Now let's take a look at the planners and the military leaders. Most important here is Gideon Welles. He was the Secretary of the Navy and thought by the middle of 1864 that it was time to raise with President Lincoln the pleas of Rear Admiral Lee for the attack on Wilmington. Secretary of War Stanton agreed as well, and their arguments were accepted by Lincoln in late August of 64 if, and this was a big if General Grant would supply the necessary troops to accompany the Navy forces. Welles would then set his assistant Secretary of the Navy, Gustavus Fox, to discuss the ideas with General Grant, who would have to provide the troops necessary. Grant was at first reluctant to guarantee any troops because he didn't want to spare them from his siege of Richmond and Petersburg. But he finally agreed to supply troops for an October sailing. And for leadership, Welles wanted Admiral David Farragut, who was a hero of the war, obviously, and the first admiral of the United States Navy, to lead the naval forces. But Farragut declined for health reasons, so they selected Rear Admiral David Porter, which more than deeply disappointed Samuel Lee, who wanted to be the man in charge of the naval forces and thereby be able to garner the approval of all the people for a win. But Lee was required to relinquish his position to David Porter of the North Atlantic Squadron, and during September, the plans were made in coordination with Grant's headquarters to introduce Porter and to begin the plans. Here's Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Fox, who was the perfect aide to Secretary Welles, loyal, competent, hardworking, and without ambition for his boss's job. He was the one who recommended Admiral Porter when Farragut became unavailable, and he implemented the plans proposed by Welles in a cooperation of Army and Navy that was workmanlike, even if slowing to develop. A joint amphibious operation like this was very rare, and to coordinate the Army and the Navy, who were traditionally extreme rivals, was very difficult to do. During October and November, Gustavus Fox asked Grant for the date when he could embark, when he could be promised the delivery of the troops that were needed. And Grant put him off repeatedly by saying he didn't want to spare any of his men. But finally, Grant allowed the troops to be moved to Newport News, where the Navy was assembling transport ships, and allowed General Butler to be in command of the Army troops that were going to accompany the naval ships. Here's a picture of Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter. He was an experienced, tough, and smart wartime commander, having served in New Orleans and Vicksburg campaigns. At age 51, he had served continuously in the Navy since he had been 10 years old. While he did a good job of assembling the naval forces and was clearly authoritative and decisive, several incautious, cocksure decisions on his part nearly torpedoed the attack and almost caused the failure, and certainly cost many sailors' lives. This was characteristic of the pride and lack of experience in combined land-sea operations, as well as his attempt to outshine his foster brother, Farragut, actually raised in the same family, even though Farragut was unrelated to Foster, raised in the same family. Here's a picture of General Godfrey Weitzel, who was Grant's choice to lead the Army troops. Admiral Porter already knew Weitzel and approved. He was a 29-year-old Corps commander and chief engineer of the Army of the James. If he had any deficiency, it was as an engineer, he was very cautious. He didn't have a lot of force of will necessary when the going got tough. His experience was to be defensive. General Weitzel, however, had already traveled to visit the fleet offshore and to survey the project as it was being planned. 15,000 troops that had been requested by Porter to accompany the Navy, but Weitzel said they only needed 6,000. So the transports were cut to carry just 6,000. And another change was General Weitzel's superior, General Sam Butler, decided that he wanted to take over control and be the commander of the Army during this campaign. And he thus superseded Weitzel, and Weitzel, being a loyal man to his mentor, decided that he would not protest and continue as the second in command. Ben Butler insisted on assuming command with the excuse that the appointed Army General Weitzel was inexperienced, and the magnitude, he explained, of the project required a mature commander. Well, Ben Butler was anything but a mature commander. Butler actually wanted to regain his reputation, which was in shreds after his failure of leadership in New Orleans and a bungled attack on Petersburg. Grant had absolutely no confidence in Butler's abilities, but apparently did not want to prohibit the influential Butler from going. Butler was one of those citizen soldiers, not a trained military man at all. He had formerly been the governor of Massachusetts, but he was instrumental in raising a tremendous number of Massachusetts volunteers, and he assumed the command of those volunteers. And as a result of assuming command, he was made a major general, even though he had no military experience whatsoever. Admiral Porter was furious that Butler had superseded Weitzel, for Porter had known the deficiencies of Butler from previous campaigns and hoped that he would never see him again. As for the South, here is General Braxton Bragg, who had begun his military career years ago fighting in the Seminole Wars and the Mexican War. But it was his loss at Chattanooga the previous year that torpedoed his active command, and he was returned to Richmond to be a military advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Davis liked the man, although others thought he was cold, aloof, indecisive, and incapable of admitting error. Those were qualities that were not very well received in the campaign for Fort Fisher. The rumors of the imminent attack on Wilmington caused President Davis to send Braxton Bragg down to command the district around Wilmington and to take 6,000 regular Confederate soldiers to beef up the strength of the defenses in that area. Bragg arrived in Wilmington on December 17, 1864, only 1 week before the battle began, before the campaign began. He brought a division of experienced soldiers with him, but they would ultimately prove to be not enough. Here's Colonel William Lamb of the North Carolina Artillery. He'd been the commander of the fort for the previous 3 years and had been the architect of the tremendous strength that the fort had assumed as a result of building these traverses and strengthening the parapets for the guns, and also obtaining more cannon for the defense. While his pleas for more cannons were met, he never was able to get enough troops to adequately man the garrison. And it was this inability to obtain reinforcements that seriously weakened the defenses. Major General Whiting was Lamb's commander of the fort and had been the district commander of Wilmington until Braxton Bragg arrived. He and Lamb had worked tirelessly for the previous 3 years to make Fort Fisher what people call the Gibraltar of the Atlantic. Very strong. Now let's look at the first expedition, December of 1864. Here you can see in the Atlantic, Butler and Porter sailing from Hampton Roads and Newport News with the naval ships and the Army transports. They first circled around to Beaufort, which you can see 2/3 of the way to Fort Fisher, where they had a protected harbor waiting for good weather before sailing on to Fort Fisher to begin the bombardment. For the defense, Lee and Richmond had sent troops westward in a roundabout railroad trip to Wilmington, and those troops arrived about the same time as Braxton did, just shortly before the war. Because of the delay during October and November of '64, Porter was worried about winter storms. And his fleet was running out of time to make the attack before the winter storm season began. That's why he stopped at Beaufort first, because of a winter storm forcing his ships to safety until the storm passed. But then he arrived on December 23rd off of Fort Fisher, and that night he had a bomb ship towed close to the shore and fuses lit as an experiment to see whether or not he could destroy the fort by a tremendous explosion outside the walls and see if they could knock them down. This was an old scow that was filled with 200 tons of powder and towed onto the beach. The only trouble is they put it on the beach too far from the walls, and when it went off, the blast was spectacular, but it was too far from the walls of the fort to do any damage. Okay, here you can see at this star just off the beach was where the bomb ship was exploded. It was more than 1,000 yards from the walls of the fort and caused no damage. So as a result, on December 23rd, after the explosion had failed, Admiral Porter started his bombardment on December 24th. And here's the first bombardment from the sea and against the sea face, and from the north against the land face. All of the ships opened up. They had more than 635 guns on more than 50 naval ships, and there were 21 transports that carried the Army men. The fleet expended over 20,000 shells in the first day in a futile attempt to knock down the traverses. What they should have been concentrating on was the parapets, the cannon between the traverses, because when they focused on the traverses, all those shells were absorbed by the sand. On the Union side, if there were any casualties, they were self-inflicted, as some cannons were defective and exploded, killing their handlers. That barrage on December 24th ended after 5 hours. Admiral Porter, incorrectly believing that the weak response from the cannon of the fort indicated that they were badly damaged. However, there was very, very little damage done because of the inaccuracy of the firing by the Navy. In contrast to the 20,000 shells fired by the Union forces during this 5-hour period, the defenders have fired only 600 shells because they had to conserve them. Otherwise, they weren't going to be able to fight another day. Here's the picture looking ashore from the viewpoint of the Union ships. You can see how they're all massed and carefully placed so that they could fire onto the fort from their positions. 3 lines of attackers. Included in the Union forces in the Navy, this was a ship called New Ironsides, the latest in naval firepower. The Civil War marked the intersection of sailing ships and modern steamships. The Navy was making the shift from ships that were sailed by being pushed by the wind and being built out of wood to steel ships that relied only on steam propulsion. So this was an innovation. This New Ironside ship clearly was the future of the Navy, although the old Navy men who had grown up in the sailing ships were, of course, very upset about the fact that they were being replaced by machines. Here's another picture of the New Ironside. It was considered the Navy's most powerful ship in the task force. Here's the picture of Admiral Porter's headquarters. It was the USS Malvern, his flagship. It was a former captured blockade runner that he used because it was speedy, and he was able to go back and forth between the various units that he needed to coordinate and he used it very effectively. Some of the attackers were called monitors. These were either single or double turret monitors, just like the monitor that faced the Merrimack in early 1862. The monitors, however, were a dead end in engineering history because they had no ocean-going capability. They were fine on rivers and calm waters, but they couldn't go on the ocean because they got swamped. However, they did have big guns, and they were able to throw significant firepower if they were able to find a place where they weren't going to be swamped by the waves. And here are the three different kinds of technology that converged on the Fort Fisher campaign. The monitors in the front, a double turret and a single turret monitor. The new Ironsides in the middle, which represented the future of the Navy because it had ocean-going capabilities. It could go on the open ocean where the monitors could not. And the old Navy on the right, the sailing ships, those were on their way out. During the morning of December 26th, as the bombardment was recommenced and troops were preparing to land north of the fort, one of the truly daring escapades of the battle took place in the south at the New Inlet, right at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. Admiral Porter wanted to make sure that the river entrances could not be navigated by his ships, as he believed that an attack from the rear on the fort would be very effective if his ships could get onto the river and attack the fort, which was undefended, from the riverside. And he sent this young and daring Lieutenant William Cushing, who had already successfully led raiding parties several times along the coast, in small boats to take soundings of the mouth of the river to see whether or not any of the larger Union ships could pass over the shallow water and get into the river. The reconnaissance by Lieutenant Cushing subjected him to a veritable rain of fire from the shore, and he retreated quickly with the conclusion that there was much too shallow for any of the Union ships to attempt to enter. On Christmas Day, 1864, the landings began. The bombardments continued, but you can see from the arrows near the top, these are where the Weitzel's men streamed ashore. This is the most delicate part of the operation, because if the troops could be defeated on the beach, the attack would fail. It was just like D-Day in 1944. If you could keep the soldiers streaming ashore from getting off the beach, they were going to be dead men. Braxton Bragg lost his nerve. He had his 6,000 men in Wilmington, but he refused to approach, and he stayed no closer than Sugarloaf, which you see at the top, which was a ridge of land. His troops could only watch as all these troops came ashore instead of pushing against them when they had the chance. As darkness fell, more than 3,000 men had gotten ashore, and Weitzel had moved ahead to take a look at the face of the land face of the fort, which was a mile south of where they landed. And Weitzel concluded that it was just too tough a prospect for him to attack. This was his defensive nature showing itself. When he relayed his apprehensions and his reluctance to attack back to General Butler, who was still offshore on the ships, Butler decided to call off the attack. And he immediately departed back to the launch point back in Newport Roads and left his troops behind. The troops were evacuated the next day, and the Navy and the Army transports retreated to Beaufort without a commander, as Butler had abandoned them. This shows the final position of the troops in front of the land face. The black dots are the Union forces. They had advanced to take a look, and this is when Weitzel decided that he would not attack and withdrew them, and they went back a mile north and got back on the boats and the Army transports and retreated. However, the campaign was not over. Colonel Lamb in the fort knew that they would be back. Braxton Bragg thought with winter approaching very soon that the winter storms would keep the Navy away. But Lamb knew that there was still a window where they could come back and attack again. But what to do about leadership? General Grant obviously was very disappointed with what had happened to Butler and losing his nerve. And this error would not be repeated, as he this time appointed a very capable General Alfred Terry, to assume the command of the Army. The troops were up from 6,000 to 9,000, and it also included artillery and engineers for any of the possibilities that might be presented for attacking the fort. By January 5th, Terry had rejoined and assumed command of the Army troops that were waiting in Beaufort and the naval forces that were guarding them, and they were ready to return and sail back to Fort Fisher. The second bombardment was very much the same as the first. It began on the evening of January 12th. And again, the landings were on the beach about a mile north of the fort, and there were 59 ships and 21 troop transports. This time, Porter concentrated his fire on the parapets, the cannons in the parapets, in order to dismantle all of the defenses, and was very effective. By the time the troops were landed, Porter didn't know it, but the land face was completely destroyed as far as cannon protection. All they had were the soldiers, but without any cannons. In the fort, Colonel Lamb, who was in the commander of the fort, had telegraphed Bragg up in Wilmington about the return of the attackers, and Bragg had ordered some troops south out of Wilmington, but not as far as the fort. He was unwilling to send them close to the fort, which meant that General Terry had to face Confederate forces both to the north, as Bragg's men moved south to Sugar Wolf again, but stopped at Sugar Wolf and didn't advance. General Terry had to have a rear guard facing north, as well as the majority of his troops marching south to the face of the fort. Implicit in Bragg's failure to send his forces through to the fort was Bragg's belief that the fort would have to fend for itself. They were on their own. Here's another shot of the second expedition's firing on the shoreline and the shore defenses. You can see all these splashes from returning fire. That's a bit of an exaggeration, because by this time, many of the cannon had been destroyed, and the few remaining cannon that were still effective were out of shells. So it was a moot point of what kind of defense the cannon could provide. And then on 7 o'clock in the morning on January 13th, the fleet opened up with more than 600 cannon, initially concentrating on the landing site for the troops so that would force away any defenders from the beach, and the troops could stream ashore unopposed. Here's a picture of how the ships sent their smaller boats loaded with soldiers to land on the beach, where they were formed up and formed lines to face north against any attack from Wilmington, and to march south to confront the face of the fort. Here again is a duplicate of what had happened in December, with the troops landing up on the north, about a mile north of the fort, forming up a skirmish line to face north against Sugarloaf, where Braxton Bragg observed what was going on but refused to take any action, and the rest of the troops moving with General Terry down to the fort's land face. After the landings had been finished in the afternoon of January 13th, during the next day, January 14th, Terry positioned his men in front of the land face, getting his men in position for the attack the next day. Porter on his part said that he would stop the shelling at 3 o'clock on the next day and blow all the ship's whistles as a signal for the attack to begin on the land. This shows the placement of the army against the land face, these blue arrows coming down from the north. The small blue arrow on the right-hand side along the beach was a different detachment of sailors who wanted to volunteer to go ashore and fight with the soldiers. The army refused to let them join with the soldiers, so the sailors got together in groups and decided that they would attack separately. That was a dreadful mistake, because their armament consisted only of pistols and cutlasses, which were, of course, absolutely useless until you came to hand-to-hand combat. And that hand-to-hand combat could only happen if you got over the palisades, crawled up a 30-foot-high traverse, and faced your enemy face-to-face. That was not going to happen because the beach was 600 yards wide, completely exposed to the fire down from the traverses onto these defenseless sailors, and they were killed by the hundreds. This is a picture of how the sailors tried to advance off the beach and up towards the northeast bastion. But as I said, with hand weapons, they were completely defenseless until they faced their enemy face to face. Most of these sailors never made it past the palisades and had to retreat because the palisades provided no protection from the fire from above. Here's a picture of what happened when the attack began at 3 o'clock the next day. The troops all converged on the gate on the left-hand side, streamed in and behind the traverses, making the defenders' job extremely difficult because they had to fight against the rest of the forces that were still outside the traverses, as well as the forces that had made it through the gate and were now behind them. And what was Bragg doing? He was stuck on Sugarloaf, about 2 miles north, with his 6,000 men, just looking on without putting any pressure on the rear guard or any pressure on relieving the fort itself. Now as the battle advanced during the day, Lamb and Whiting retreated along the traverses over to the northeast bastion and then south along the sea face as they were forced back by the forces that moved from one traverse to the next, forcing them back, capturing and killing the defenders. It was at this point that Terry was so confident that Bragg was paralyzed that he even withdrew his northward-facing troops that were providing the rear guard and threw them into the battle as well. And these were very special, experienced troops who added to the number and completely overwhelmed the defenses of the defenders. And during the night of January 15th, the defenders were forced back and fought without leadership. Groups of defenders began to surrender, and Terry ordered some of his defensive troops, including the 27th Colored Troops, off the rear guard and into the battle as well. Here's a picture of the 27th Colored from New York, who were sent into the battle as additional strength to help the exhausted soldiers who had been battling all day. In the evening, the remaining defenders, about 300 in number out of the 1,500 total that had begun the battle, those that were not captured or dead carried both wounded Lamb and Whiting, retreated to Battery Buchanan at the far southern end of the point. Here they hoped that Bragg would finally realize that he had to commit his forces to helping him in the defense, but it was not to be. Bragg sent a representative down to Lamb and Whiting at Battery Buchanan to the south, where both men were in hospital stretchers. But when that representative of Bragg saw how desperate the situation was, he turned around and got back in his boat and went back up to Wilmington to report to Bragg that it was hopeless. General Terry was summoned about midnight of the evening, and he accepted the surrender from Lamb and Whiting as they lay on their hospital stretchers. Signals were flashed to the fleet, and Porter ordered rockets fired into the night sky in celebration. The next morning, scavenging and looting troops apparently wandered into the main magazine of the fort with torches, and the main magazine exploded, killing another 200 soldiers and captives. In addition to these post-battle casualties, Union losses were about 1,400 men, Army men, and about 300 sailors and Marines. Confederate losses were about 500 men, and the rest captured. Whiting died in prison about 2 months later, but Lamb survived with a terrible hip wound that left him on crutches for years. Secretary of War Stanton, coincidentally, toured the fort on January 16th as he happened to be sailing by on his way to Washington after conferring with General Sherman in South Carolina. Secretary of War Stanton was, of course, delighted with the victory, and heaped praise on both Porter and Terry. As for Bragg, the shock of the loss of Fort Fisher did not delay his plans to abandon Wilmington. By February 22nd, barely a month later, he was gone, and the city had fallen as Union troops moved up on both sides of the river in a pincer movement. A large opportunity could have been made, but no effort to create a diversion by Bragg sealed the fate of the fort. Additionally, the fort was strongest on the sea face to withstand a naval bombardment, while the land face was weaker because it was assumed that any supporting troops in Wilmington would come down to reinforce the land face. Never happened. Time heals all wounds. Here, Colonel Lamb is shown on the left with one of Terry's brigade commanders, Colonel Newton Curtis, sometime long after the war. They faced each other in the battle, but were friends afterwards. And here's a look at Fort Fisher today. The blue is the Atlantic Ocean. You can see the line on the right-hand side is what used to be the shoreline, and the fort was on the beach behind the shoreline. But sometime in the early 1900s, there was an awful lot of dredging done, and all of that beach just disappeared. And you can see how much of the fort was now underwater and destroyed. Yet they have a very nice state park there, and they have preserved as much as they could that's still on land, still dry. And that's the end. Thank you.